and welcome to the Berean Bookclub podcast with your hosts Francois Poe and Conrad Rieder, the podcast where we discuss books written by saints both dead and alive to see what they can teach us and the church today, and hopefully spur us on in our love for Christ. We're so glad you're joining us.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of the Berean Bookclub podcast. Bro, how are you hanging at this hour?
Yeah, as Conrad is saying, it's 9 p.m. This side, and it's the first one that we're recording at night, not in the morning. So we're gonna see how it goes. There's a different vibe to it, at least for us.
It's much more exciting. I
Yeah, feels like naughty little kids.
think. Yeah, it's underground. It's secretive.
So it's going good. I'm excited.
Yeah. This episode we're looking at a book by Joni Eareckson called Songs of Suffering. It's a little bit different to the normal books that we've been spending time on, in the sense that it's a little bit more devotional, but it's even a bit of a different kind of a devotional book, as she kind of picks 25 songs, which have accompanied her in her sufferings, and she kind of unpacks a little bit from her own life, the lessons that she's learned, from those hymns, from relying on those hymns during suffering, and just lessons that she's learned from suffering in general. So it's been a different kind of book to tackle, but it's been really cool.
It's definitely been unique.
It's been really cool. Well, why don't we somewhere just jump straight in there?
We said this is how we're going to go from now on,
Yes.
so let's do it.
No more small talk. Let's get to it. How would you answer me if I asked you, why does Joni write this book?
So we're going to call her Joni because that's the way she refers to herself in the book. So I think the first thing that happens when you read the book is you try and figure out who is this lady. Okay, so before we talk about why she wrote the book, I think it's helpful for us to understand a little bit about who she is and her life. And so her name's Joni Eareckson Tada, and she's at this moment 73 years old, a Christian woman who's experienced immense suffering throughout her life, and that pretty much started when she was 17. When she was 17, she dived into a lake, and she misinterpreted the depth of the water, and unfortunately she fractured her vertebra, and then she became quadriplegic, which meant that she was paralyzed from the shoulders down from the age of 17. And so she's had to live with that since the age of 17, coupled with a lot of chronic pain that has just gotten worse and worse, it seems, over the years. Difficult questions about why did this happen. She was an active woman, and now in the peak years of her life, this happens to her. She struggled a lot with depression and dealing with what God has given her. And even further on in her life, we see that she's had cancer. She went in for treatment, declared cancer-free. Then it came back. She had cancer again. And in 2018, it was said that she's cancer-free again. But the fact of the matter is, I think this is why Joni can write a book on suffering, is because she is a woman of God who has walked with the Lord through suffering for most of her life. So when you ask me about suffering, you should listen to what I say and be like, yeah, Francois was 30 years old. Maybe what he's saying is true, maybe not. Let's wait and see. But it's very different when you listen to an old saint who has lived this out for years and years and years. And I think that's really what she wanted to do in this book. She wanted to marry two of her great loves. And the one is she wanted to show you how beautiful Jesus is. and especially show you that through how he's used suffering in her life to accomplish kind of that love that she has now come to know. But not only that, some of the tools that she's really used to be able to learn from suffering, and that is song. And so those are the two things she puts together in this devotional. She chose these 25 songs that she's memorized, that she's got down in her mind. And they are tools that she uses when suffering comes her way, when chronic pain comes her way, when she can't move at night, she can't ask her husband to help her, she can't read anything at that stage. The songs that she has kind of put into her mind, that she can sing to the Lord, give words and expression to the feeling she has, and reminds her kind of where to turn in that moment. And so as she's learned to use song in this way, and the way in which it has helped her, I think her desire was then to say, I really want to share this with the world, because suffering is going to come to each and every person, especially if you are a child of God. And when that suffering comes, she wants you to have these tools that she's learned, especially these beautiful songs. So that's why I think she wrote the book. It's really, I think, a deep desire to equip the saints to not resist suffering, but to be able to learn through it, and primarily doing that through memorizing these beautiful hymns that we can sing to God in that moment.
Yeah. I mean, for Joni, being quadriplegic, that obviously limits her accessibilities to stuff, and one of the ways in which she's offset that, or try to offset that, is by memorizing songs and hymns to recall. But I mean, even though that restriction of accessibility doesn't kind of sit on all of us, there's still something like immensely valuable about this kind of habit that she's almost got into throughout her life of memorizing a song and recalling that in a way to kind of face up to suffering, and in a way to recall God's goodness and his promises and how he works and how we work and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, this is not at all, I think, explicitly what she may be trying to do in the book, but you just see how this discipline or this habit is played out in her life, and you do go like, wow, man, that's something we should do.
Yeah. And it's interesting, when you have kids, you start to see how well songs kind of teach. And so we're doing catechism with the kids, and as you teach them, the first thing they ask is, can we listen to this week's song? Can we listen to this week's song? Because they learn the song before they learn kind of the words. That's how they learn the words. And I think it's true for us as adults as well. I think it's Luther that said, after God's word, music is the most precious thing God has given humans. Something like that. He wrote many hymns and stuff, if I recall correctly. And this is a kind of that just played out, like songs and its ability to really grab our hearts, orientate us towards the Lord, give words to these deep expressions that we have, that we struggle to really put to voice. It's like really helpful when we have songs that have gone before us and we can sing them.
Throughout the book, she looks at 25 hymns, which is it's a significant number of hymns. I'm not even sure I could say I've memorized that many Christian songs.
Not even close.
No,
I need all the lyrics every time.
Yes. And I'm sure she could have written a book much longer than 25 devotional pieces. As I said earlier, throughout the book, there's there's a lot as she reflects on her life, as she reflects on things that she's learned, as she reflects on what she calls her pain pals, people from all over the world that she shares experiences with and God's goodness with. As we've worked our way through all 25, and just hearing her reflect on those, what are some lessons you would say you've walked away with from listening to her?
Yeah, like you said, there are many of these songs to talk about, and each one has a story that grabs you in a certain sense, and or it has to do with her life or one of her pain pals. And for someone that hasn't truly suffered that much in life, it is extraordinary to listen to these stories of faith, people entrusting themselves to God in light of their suffering. So you can't really single out like any of them as being like super special. But I did think the book, although it doesn't aim to teach us necessarily theologically about suffering, it does, I think, help us to have the right attitude when it comes to suffering. And so a few things I'll kind of like pick up on. The first one is where she calls us to, in John, God calls us to abide in him, and that will lead to us bearing fruit. And she goes on about God's desire for his children is to bear fruit. And the way in which that happens is to abide in him. And she makes the case then that the only way we can truly abide in him is if we are grafted into, as a branch, into the tree. And overall, she makes the case that the only way that we truly abide in him, truly come to live with Christ in deep communion with him, is through the orchestrated sufferings that crosses our paths by the master vine dresser. And so that was one of the things that she really picks up on, is the fact that if you are a Christian, you must recognize that God is going to prune you. He is going to cut you and join you to this tree. And the point she makes there is a vine that is attached to the tree. You can put it on with a piece of rope, but it's not going to bear fruit. It may be attached, but it's not going to bear fruit. The only way for that to truly happen is if you are grafted in. And so she has this one quote that she says there. She asks the question after making the case that all Christians are going to experience suffering, especially as God joins us to himself. And she asks the question, are you a rigid twig, stiffening against the sharpened edge of suffering's knife? It may be terribly painful, but release your anxiety, yield to the blade, be wedged against Christ, heart to heart. Afflictions will not permit you to be his mere acquaintance. He wants you to be of his most prized disciples. And there again, it is, she just shows us so beautifully that what God wants for us is truly so much greater than that which we will ever choose for ourselves. And so he sends suffering to prune us, to shape us, and to join us to himself. Because in suffering, you cannot be a mere acquaintance. You cannot go through suffering and be like, oh, whatever, God, or God is like against me, or God is for me here. I have to really go with one or the other. And it forces us to go on our knees and to really deal with that.
She really she embodies that so well. Suffering it's obviously like a complex thing, and it's one of those things. I share so much of how you feel reading this book, where she's been, she's had like 50, 60 years of living with this and going through like immense amounts of suffering. And you read her book and you're like, wow, man, I haven't suffered, you know. And so I mean, you feel some of that, right? But there's this complex kind of like world to navigate when it comes to how we as Christians navigate suffering. We don't kind of not expect it and just expect that everything's gonna be fine and that we're gonna have prosperity and blessing and so on the side of eternity. But at the same time, we also don't kind of have a stoic approach to suffering, like, you know, it's there, but it's not going to get me down. She kind of like is really able to hold that balance well, to recognize the hurt and the pain, and the abnormality of suffering, while at the same time still able to press into it. Is the language that she uses, to press into your sufferings, because we should expect that this is what God's going to use as the vine dresser. And she's just really able to navigate that space well. Because I do think it's difficult for us sometimes as Christians to understand the place that suffering has and how we respond to it. Do we act all tough, like, you know, we're immovable and it's not really going to hurt us? Do we act all surprised, like we shouldn't be facing these kind of things? Those are difficult questions to wrestle with.
Yes.
And she just navigates that so well, to recognize that it's hard, but to still recognize that it's good to press into it, because God's going to use this.
It's so good. And I think that was really helpful in kind of this song that I just spoke about. She gives the overarching kind of premise for what happens in suffering. God is using suffering for his good, okay? And for your good, as he joins you to himself, as he cuts you and grafts you in. That's the kind of the premise. This is what God is going to accomplish. But then she's not like, every time that happens, she's like, oh, okay, let me just remember that. She then has to practically show, like, what does it look like in the moment, in that moment? What does it look like to submit to this suffering that I'm experiencing? I think that's what you mean with not falling off one side or the other, but really drawing into the suffering. And so she says here, she says this about what she does when suffering comes. When I feel the pain in my lower back, it is a signal for me to begin deep breathing. I then walk into the pain and hold it near me, even have a conversation with it. I don't fret and say, oh, this is killing me, I can't stand this, or oh, not again. Words like that are fraught with anxiety, and we all know that fear only exasperates the problem. Instead, I serenely acknowledge the pain and allow it to press me in on all sides, and then I take one last step of faith. I ask my Savior not to let it crush me, but to meet me in it, and he always does. And there, I think here's where she explains how she goes about dealing with suffering. And that ability that kind of she has to, when suffering comes on her doorstep, in that moment, our temptation is always to complain. And it's not because it's not difficult. It is something that is like so much part of our nature. Every time, in a small sense, in my life, and you've experienced that now with Seb as well. When he wakes you up for the 5th time at night, and you think to yourself, yes, am I really going to have to get up now again? And your wife's angry and everything's going crazy, and it's like really, then the temptation is to complain. The temptation is to kind of like escape from that. And here she says, can we have the attitude, can we have the eyes to see what God is busy doing and ask ourselves, okay, this is what I'm feeling right now. This is the difficulty that I'm experiencing right now. God, how are you shaping me right now? What are you trying to show me as I struggle through this? And I think to have that attitude is something that I deeply long for. because of what she has said in that first song that I've spoken about. I know this is how God is shaping me. My prayer to the Lord is now, as I suffer, will you help me to kind of not fight against it, but to really press into the suffering and say, Lord, use it. Help me to see what you are doing right now. And I thought it was very practical, the way in which she explained that. She does say that it's a hard discipline that's learned over time. So she is 70, however, years old now, and has been doing this for so many years. So it's not like we flick our fingers and now when suffering comes, we just submit to it. I promise you, she's honest enough to say that that's not how she always responds. But it is something that we strive towards to, So be careful about the way in which we speak about our suffering when it comes. We can quickly kind of just add more anxiety and more fear by the way in which we're speaking about the suffering. I can't do this. I can't do this. It's going to kill me. That those words don't press us into our suffering. It kind of like kicking back against it at every side.
While you're speaking about just complaint in the face of suffering, as I step back from this book, that's certainly the thing which stood out the most to me. And it's not necessarily even one thing that she said, but just a couple of things that she said in dealing with complaint during suffering, and stuff, which really, really struck me. She speaks about complaint during suffering to have this kind of choking effect, for our gratitude, that it chokes out our gratitude. And this is really something which I think all of us can relate to, if not with ourselves, at least with some folk around us who we're close to and who we know well, that after a while, particularly if your suffering is, I want to say chronic, but like long term, that it's not something that just goes away and disappears. There's a tendency that we complain so much that we're entirely just focused on our suffering, to a point that we almost reach a place where we feel we are owed. We feel that we are owed, whether that's from we're owed by folk who we know. Sometimes it can even reach a point where we look at God and we feel like He owes us. What blew my mind, just in how she's dealing with and wrestling through suffering, is she's able to recognize the hardness of suffering and the pain and stuff that goes with that. But she looks at God in her suffering, and she still is grateful that he died for her sin, and that she was entirely undeserving of that. She's even after all of her suffering, she's able to look at God and not feel like He owes me a better life. She's able to look at Him and still say, I owe Him my everything for what He's done for me. I mean, if there's anyone who is owed, not by God, but if there's anyone who is owed, Joni's one of them.
Pretty high up there.
She's gone through like 60 years of living like this. But she is at a place where she looks at God and she still goes, you are my greatest joy. I owe you everything because you died for my sin.
Oh, man.
It's incredible.
It's absolutely beautiful.
Coming from her. She captures this way of thinking in one of her reflections on one of the hymns. I hadn't heard of this hymn before. The hymn is called "O Sacred Head Now Wounded," but this is what she says: when you're hurting badly, You want assurance that Jesus feels your pain, that he understands and is with you in it. It's why we are drawn to hymns that extol Christ as the one who identifies with our hardships. We sing hymns like this and think, Jesus understands me. He realizes what I'm going through. He's been tested as I have. He resonates with my suffering. O sacred head now wounded is not like that, she says. This hymn forces us to identify with Jesus in his suffering, and if it were possible, helps us to understand what he went through. Each stanza prays our eyes off of our suffering and onto his. I admire sufferers who are masters at this, keeping exquisite focus on Christ and his cross rather than theirs. They make less of themselves and more of Jesus. And she's being very humble in saying that she admires sufferers who suffer like that because she suffers like that.
Yeah. That's her whole book, is an example of someone who does that. It's difficult to guys, as you I think we both recognize that suffering is a really difficult topic, and we feel completely inadequate to really speak on this well. We don't know many of you and where you are in your life as you listen to this, but just at least at this point, we just want to encourage you to give this book a listen. I do think whatever you are going through, this book will truly encourage you to persevere and to not that you'll necessarily understand your suffering and the why, all those questions, but I think you'll fall in love with Jesus more as you do that.
As we wrap up, take a step back. What would be your final thoughts on a book like this?
Yeah, I think we already touched on the one that I wanted to speak about. Just Joni speaks, or we hear a lot from Joni in this book. But as you listen to the book and you hear what she's saying and you listen to her tone of voice, I walk away recognizing that Joni is a lady who has found deep, deep joy in the Lord. And that flows out of her voice, the way in which she speaks, the way in which she's able to have compassion on others that suffer. Her whole being is just, it's beautiful. It's really attractive to listen to. And so just on that, her life for me is an example that what she says is true. The reality is we don't know people. She wrote the book. We don't really know her, but at least from what we can hear, this is an example of someone that God has grafted in, that abides in him, that through that process is now bearing the fruit of the Spirit, full of joy and peace and love. And I that's just the one thing that I wanted to say. Maybe the second thing is the way in which she makes a very, very helpful point that in our suffering, our temptation that one of the temptations that we face is to go back and try and get that life that we had before suffering arrived. So whether that's a divorce or whether in her case, kind of her accident at the lake, there's this temptation to build your life again, to come back to the place where you were. And that's very natural. Okay, but she makes the point that God is in the business of changing us into the image of his Son. That's what he's doing. He's not interested in your comfort, the way in which you thought you had it in the past or before suffering arrived. He's truly interested in you and the whole of you. And so she just reminded me that when suffering comes, be careful where your eyes go. Don't look back to what you had and kind of long for that and think you're ever going to have that again. That's kind of resisting what God is busy doing. Rather, look forward to what God is going to accomplish one day and what he is busy accomplishing right now, and then submit to that as best you can. And that was just helpful for me. I do kind of recognize, again, in the smallest sense, we often just think back. Oh, remember what it was like when we could just go out for a night and enjoy each other's company. Now we have to organize babysitters and all our money goes to the kids. Now, again, that's suffering on such a, it doesn't even count. Okay, but it is still a way in which I learn to deal with what the situations that I face, and I see that temptation. And when suffering really comes, I do think that's something to be careful for. Yeah. Any last thoughts from your side, maybe, as we?
I think, I listened to the audiobook this month, and this is one of the audiobooks which she actually reads. And so you really have the privilege of just kind of almost being in a conversation with her.
Yeah.
You can hear what she's feeling as she speaks and as she reads these words. And I mean, we've touched on this already, but that's something, stepping back from the book, which you're really able to do. You're able to hear her joy in Jesus and hear her frustration and her pain with her suffering. And it makes this book one of those books which you have to go and listen to her read it in order to get the fullness of it. It's one thing to hear us talk about it. It's a whole other thing to go and read it yourself and have a listen to her reading it in particular. It's quite powerful. And so I think, that's just, as we step away, as we wrap up our conversation, she embodies what she's saying. You're right, we don't know her. We've read one of her books and maybe watched some interviews, and that's it. But she certainly comes across as someone who embodies what she's saying. Her joy in the Lord as she's walked for many years, suffering with him. There's something attractive about that. It's been a good book, a good read for us, and a good read for you guys as well, if you've got the time to pick it up. We have episode 4 coming up very soon. This book is definitely the one on the list I have been the most excited for.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. The book's name is Rembrandt in the Wind by Russ Ramsey. Oh man! And I'm like 80% through, and
I haven't even started.
And to be honest, without giving away what the book's all about, it's just fascinating for a kind of a fool like me that knows very little about fine art and kind of the history of art. This was fascinating. It's a lot of story. That's part of the aim that he has in the book, is to tell the stories of the artists behind the art that we all kind of know, like some of us. And so it's a fascinating read. I can completely understand why all the kind of websites have been raving about the book. So do go pick it up. Rembrandt in the Wind by Russ Ramsey. And we hope that you guys join us there next month for that one.
Yeah. Thank you guys for still being here and sticking it out with us. We'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Grace and peace.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Berean Bookclub podcast. We'd love for you to head over to your podcasting app and give us a review and subscribe to the podcast. It will help us so much. This podcast was brought to you by BTI Stellenbosch. BTI Stellenbosch exists to bring theology to the church. If you want to find out more information, you can head over to btistellenbosch.com. Until next time.